and welcome to the June 29th meeting of the Public Safety Committee. Today, we'll be devoting the entire meeting for this committee to the final report by the University of Texas at San Antonio on its investigation of use of force by Fairfax County Police Department. This report was initiated by the previous Board of Supervisors in order to better understand the influence of civilian race, ethnicity, and other factors that impact use of force by our police department. I'd like to specifically thank that board, especially those of my colleagues who are still serving, for prioritizing this important study and giving us the tools and analysis we need to ensure that our community is as safe and as equitable as possible. And as we heard from advocates within our community and from our citizens writ large across the county, there exists a sense that force is disproportionately applied against members of the African American and Hispanic communities here in Fairfax County. I believe that the data that this report lays out is a solid first step in understanding the underlying reasons for that sentiment and will act as a compass and will guide us forward as we work to address inequities in our public safety and criminal justice infrastructure. This research project was coordinated by Mr. Richard Schott, the independent police auditor for Fairfax County. The researchers analyzed 3 years of data from 2016 to 2018 from the Fairfax County Police Department. It is important to note that the data set included 1,360 cases of force used by Fairfax County police officers against at least one civilian. Dr. Michael Smith and Dr. Rob Tillier from the University of Texas at San Antonio and Dr. Robin Engel with the University of Cincinnati are here to report on their findings and recommendations. Following their report today, we will have an opportunity to hear from Chief Davis, who will provide Fairfax County's Police Department's response to the findings and recommendations contained in this report. And at the conclusion of Chief Davis's response, we will then move to Q&A from members of this board. So at this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Michael Smith, and he has his colleagues here, Dr. Robert Tillier, and you'll see them just behind Dr. Smith, and then Dr. Robin Engel to present their report, findings, and recommendations. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Supervisor Lusk, and thank you for the opportunity to come before the board today. I'd like to also thank the members of the Fairfax County Police Department with whom we've worked for the last 18 months. They've been consummate professionals and extremely helpful to us in providing us data and answering our questions. And also Mr. Richard Schott, the independent police auditor, and his office have also been just great to work with. So again, we're pleased to be here. You'll actually hear from all three of us at some point during the presentation. I know we have, I think, a short 30 minutes. If you've had a chance to see the report, you know it's pretty voluminous. There's a lot of information in there and a lot of data. We're going to go through it at a fairly high level and fairly quickly so that we can hit all of the points that we think are important for you to hear today. I know that we have a fair amount of time booked at the end for questions. So if we don't address something that's of concern to you, then we will be happy to do that at the end. So with that, I'll get started and introduce my team. I'm Dr. Mike Smith from the University of Texas, San Antonio. I'm a criminologist and a police scholar. I've done this sort of work for 25 years. My colleague Rob Tillier at the University of Texas, San Antonio, as well, is with me. Worked extensively on the project, and then Robin Engel as well. I'm going to invite Rob up. He's going to talk a little bit about the background and the methodology that we used, and then I'll come back and go over our main findings, and Robin will close us out, talk a little bit about the training recommendations. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. Let me just make sure. Okay, good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your time today. Appreciate it. This is obviously an important subject, and we're happy to be here today. So this presentation that accompanies the report that we put together is the culmination of an 18-month project, excuse me, and as has been mentioned already, with the sort of singular focus around what factors or combination of factors are associated with or contribute to the use of force by FCPD officers. And in particular, we were interested in exploring the data and analyzing the data to understand how use of force was arrayed across different racial and ethnic groups here in this community. And so those analyses, which we'll present our main findings from in a minute, then obviously lead to a series of recommendations, both in terms of data collection and training, but also broader policies. And so on the screen there, you can see the 5 questions that sort of drove this project forward, and that's what we aimed to address. In order to address those questions, we worked collaboratively with the FCPD to access a series of different databases from their organization, including use of force records, arrest records, calls for service, and several others, and engaged a process where we merged those databases together into one comprehensive data set. And that served as the foundation for the analysis that we're going to report on today. As was mentioned, it was a 3-year examination from January 16 through December 2018. And that merging process resulted in 1,360 force events involving at least one FCPD officer and a civilian. On the screen, you can also see one of our first tasks was to take the force actions that were recorded in the database and categorize them into a continuum to make sense of and to analyze. And you can see that there it ranges, there's 4 categories ranging from least serious to most severe. And that forms the foundation of the analysis. And the large majority of what you're going to see today is based on analysis using that continuum. We also explored additionally a recoding or reconceptualization of force by taking the pointing a taser, which is a level 2, and pointing a weapon, which is level 3, and reanalyzing the data if those were considered level 1. And so we'll speak to those findings as well briefly when appropriate. So this comprehensive data set had a variety of measures in it, characteristics, if you will, of these events, including situational things, as I mentioned, the force itself, civilian resistance, which we also categorized in a similar 4-category continuum. Also includes temporal and spatial or geographic characteristics and characteristics of the broader environment in which the events occurred. Civilian and officer characteristics were appended to these events, and so that included important things that are of particular interest, like citizen race, gender, age, and similar characteristics for officers. We also had information on whether there was a mental health concern in the event, whether alcohol or drugs was present at the in the event, number of officers involved, rank, assignment, so a series of things. And that was all overlaid with additional information, as I referenced, about the violent crime rate in the context of the event, in that area, in that station, and also the race and ethnicity of the population in that area. We took the data set and we approached it in basically three fashions, right? Number one, we looked at the data at a very descriptive level to get a sense of force actions, how much of different types of force activity was occurring. Secondly, we looked at, and we were focused mostly on the identification of force by race and ethnicity of the civilian. And so we calculated rates of those, and in order to assess that, there needs to be some comparison against which those rates would be compared, and that's the benchmarking process. We used 6 different benchmarks in this particular study, and they're listed there. 3 of them came from the reported suspects database. 3 of them came from the custodial arrest database. And they included all of the cases of those 2 data sets. They included violent crime, part 1 violent crimes, and also Part 1 violent crimes, including weapons and simple assault. And so collectively, what you have is you have 6 different lenses, if you will, or comparison groups against which you can compare the rates of force by race and ethnicity. And we'll walk through what those results look like in each of those 6 benchmarks. What's important to note here is that we did not engage in any benchmarking using the residential census population. Social scientists have a relatively long history of evaluating that benchmark as not rigorous and not appropriate for determining and making assessments around use of force, and we did not do that here. And the primary reason for that is that the census, residential census population is a very poor indicator of risk of a particular group having force used against them. It's common in the media and other outlets that you may have heard, but it's not appropriate from a scientific perspective. The last analytical piece that we engaged was a series of multivariate analytic models. And in short, what that does is it attempts to identify those characteristics I showed in the previous slide, which characteristics are most related to a particular outcome or a particular occurrence. And here, again, we're focused on force. And so we ran several models looking at the maximum level of force used in an event, right? Level 3 versus level 2 versus level 1. We looked at the average level of force in these events. We looked at the total amount of force, again, using that continuum. And those models give us an indication of what are the characteristics that are most aligned with those particular outcomes. And the last piece that you'll hear about is a model that looks at the custodial arrests undertaken during this time period and whether or not force was used in that arrest. And so the assessment there is what are the characteristics that are aligned with force occurring versus during an arrest versus force not occurring during an arrest. So that's the roadmap forward. I'll turn it back over to Mike, who will present the main findings for us. Thank you.
We'll now turn to the main findings from the report. We have a series of graphs and tables further on that we will reference. This particular slide just provides you a high-level overview of the descriptive nature of the data. The top half of the slide indicates the percentage of force cases broken down by race and ethnicity. So whites comprised about 38% of the force cases that we analyzed. African Americans or blacks were about 42%. Hispanics were 16%, and Asians were about 3%. The bottom half of the slide provides you a visual representation of those force and resistance levels that Dr. Tillier laid out for you, the 1 through 4 severity scales, if you will, and how those break down by race. The blue bars are the average force level by race, and the orange bars are the average resistance level by race. And what you can see there is that there's a fair degree of consistency across the racial groups, both in terms of the average level of force used against persons here in Fairfax County, as well as the average level of resistance that is offered to the police. And there are some differences, but they're not particularly large. This next slide provides an overview of the main benchmarking findings for the entire county. We've got another slide that addresses some of the disparities at the district station level. This is the countywide findings for the main findings for benchmarking. The red lines that you see just correspond to those percentages that we just looked at. So recall that for whites, for example, they made up about 38% of the force cases. And then the colored bars underneath are the 6 benchmarks that Dr. Tillier referenced. So what you're looking for here is the degree of correspondence between that red line and the bars below it. And to the extent to which the benchmarks are close to, above, or below that red line. And so for whites, as an example, whites make up 38% of the force cases, which is actually a higher level than you would expect given the benchmarks that we used. And that's a consistent finding across all 6 benchmarks. We were chatting for a moment before the meeting about those data. You know, it's a little bit unusual to see findings like that in my experience, but those are what they were here in Fairfax County. For African Americans, you can see that the force rates at 42% exceeded the benchmarks in 4 out of the 6 cases that we analyzed. So those are the disparities that I think probably drove this study that began a couple of years ago. And with Hispanics in sorry, the slide flashed for a minute. So with Hispanics, the findings are reversed from what you saw from the previous 2 racial groups, right? So force is used less often against Hispanics than you might expect given the representation in the benchmarks. And for Asians, the findings were somewhat mixed, right? So the suspect benchmarks were, the force rates were higher than the suspect's benchmarks, but pretty closely aligned with the arrest benchmarks. This slide sort of sums up a lot of information about how those disparities differ by district station. And so what we essentially found is that force was used against African Americans in ways that exceeded the benchmarks in a number of district stations, primarily driven by the disparities in Mount Vernon, to a lesser extent in Franconia, McLean, and West Springfield. So the countywide findings are being driven primarily by those district stations, and Mount Vernon in particular. Hispanics are overrepresented as subject of force in a couple of district stations, Sully and Mason, 3 out of the 6 benchmarks that we looked at. Rates of force against Asians exceeded benchmarks in Mount Vernon, Reston, West Springfield, and Fair Oaks. And then one of the comparisons that we do is called the disparity ratio. So we examine the rates of force against a minority group relative to whites. So the whites become the sort of the comparative population. And when you look at, if you look at that finding broken down by district station, force was used against minorities in ways that exceeded that of whites in Sully for Hispanics, and Mount Vernon for blacks and Asians, McLean, blacks and Asians, Mason, Hispanics, Reston, Asians, Franconia, African Americans or blacks, West Springfield, blacks and Asians, and Fair Oaks, Asians. So there are some disparities then in the relative rates of force for minority groups versus whites, and those vary somewhat by racial group and by district station. Rob referenced the multivariate models that we engaged with, where we examined the severity of force along that continuum. We looked at the average level of force, and we looked at the totality of force across all force actions within an event. This summary slide boils all that down into basically one graph. The green bars represent positive relationships between the variable of interest and the outcome, force severity. And the red bars represent negative relationships between the variable of interest and the outcome of force severity. So I'll draw your attention to the green bars, the 2 green bars there above the male variable and the black variable as our primary variables of interest for this particular study. So what that tells you is that males, and this is not uncommon, most research of this sort finds the same thing. Males are consistently overrepresented for more severe force, right? So across all 6 of the models, relative to females, males are more likely to have more severe force used against them. African Americans the severity of force was related to the African American population in the models in 4 out of the 6 models that we ran. So It's a little bit different lens than the benchmarking lens. The benchmarking lens looked at just the overall rate of force. Was one racial group subjected to greater rates of force relative to a benchmark? This looks actually at the severity of force, right? So not just was force used against them, but was force used at higher levels or at higher average levels than some other racial group. And in this particular case here in Fairfax County, African Americans were overrepresented for the higher levels of force in 4 of the 6 benchmarks, or excuse me, 4 of the 6 multivariate models that we ran. This slide presents relative risk ratios. It's another way of looking at force severity by district station. And so these models, Dr. Tillier referenced the 4-part scale that we use for force severity. There were very few cases of level 4. That's firearm use. There were very few cases of level 4 force, so we actually dropped those out of those. They wouldn't have been meaningful contributors to this model, so they dropped out. So that's why you actually only see 3 levels in these severity models. And what the findings indicate to you are variables that are associated with higher levels of force, either level 2 or level 3, compared to the lowest level of force, level 1. A risk ratio above 1.0 indicates an increased risk. So as an example, if we could just draw your attention to the Mount Vernon column. If you follow your eyes down to the, and I'm sorry, I don't have a pointer I would use that, but follow your eyes down to the male row, you will see, consistent with that graph I showed you a minute ago, that males are consistently overrepresented or subjected to higher levels of force, both at level 2 and at level 3 compared to level 1. So that gives you an indication of how to kind of read that table. With respect to the race findings, again, blacks, and I referenced that Mount Vernon is largely the primary driver behind the racial disparities that you see countywide for African Americans. And that's reflected in this slide. So African Americans are subjected to more severe force at level 2 or level 3 relative to level 1 in Mount Vernon, in McLean, in Franconia. And then the single Hispanic finding there, disparity for Hispanics on the force severity side of things, was in Mount Vernon as well, where Hispanics were subjected to higher levels or more severe force at level 3 compared to level 1, but not at level 2. Does that make sense? Okay. Dr. Tillier referenced the reanalysis of the force data that we did. And after some preliminary discussions with senior leadership of the police department, we actually recoded the pointing of a weapon, and that's typically a taser or a firearm, which originally was coded at level 3 on that 4-part continuum. We recoded it to level 1 and reran those multivariate models to see what the impact of that coding decision would have been on the substantive outcomes. That's what this slide represents for you. So when we re-estimated those force severity models, the black civilian bar that you saw that was statistically significant became non-significant. Okay? And so and civilian resistance, which was not significant as a predictor of force levels in the earlier models, became significant. What's important to understand, though, is that the disparity in force against African Americans in particular is largely located in the pointing of a weapon at someone, right? So that third bullet point there makes that clear, that when you reanalyze the data like we did, and then you look at pointing of a weapon as its own analysis, black civilians were 1.8 times more likely to have weapons pointed at them, while considering all of the other variables or all the other factors that we considered in the model, including the seriousness of the crime. So the key takeaway here at the bottom of your slide is that these coding decisions matter. There's no right or wrong answer. It's a conceptual question. And police departments around the country and their communities are wrestling with these things right now, these very issues, you know. How serious is it to point a weapon at somebody? Is that a level 1 force, analogous to soft hand control, or is it a more severe type of force, right? So that matters, and you know, this community will have to, you know, reach its own conclusions about in future analyses about where to put those levels of force, how to array your force continuum. The last model that we ran predicted force used during arrest, and this is simply a yes or no. Was force used during arrest or not? Same kind of setup. The green bars indicate a positive relationship. The red bars indicate a negative relationship. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go through them all, but for our purposes, an interest in racial and ethnic disparities, this model showed that black civilians were at greater risk for having force used against them, all other things being equal, in arrest situations. This analysis is not impacted by the coding decision, by the way, about where force pointing of a firearm ought to fall in the continuum. It's simply a yes, was force used, yes or no, and what are the odds of that? And they were higher for African Americans. I'd like to spend a little bit of time now going through our recommendations. There's an extensive set of recommendations in the report that follows and flows from the analysis. And the first set have to do with data collection. So the Fairfax County Police Department collects a lot of information and a lot of information on force cases. That said, there were some significant limitations to their force data. And so we have a lot of recommendations here about how they can improve future data collection that would facilitate for, you know, the next analysis down the road. Better data typically produces better analysis and greater understanding. So we made some recommendations here, and again, in the interest of time, I won't go through them bullet point by bullet point, but I'll highlight just a few for you as we go through the next couple of slides. Capturing the uses of force and resistance sequentially, so what happened first, then what happened next, is sort of state of the art. It's where the field is going and where our recommendation is the police department's data collection ought to go. That will provide us the ability to have a much more nuanced and greater understanding of how these events transpire, right? How do some escalate quickly? How do some not escalate quickly, right? Or how do they de-escalate? That's the kind of data that you need to be able to answer those kinds of important questions. The other bullet point I'll mention here on this particular slide is a couple, I guess. The effectiveness. We have a recommendation that the police department start capturing effectiveness for all types of force used. That's an important consideration from a training and a policy perspective that's not currently reflected adequately in the data. And then we have a recommendation that the police department begin capturing instances when deadly force could have been used under law and policy, could have been used but was not. And what we know is that in police departments across the country, this happens a lot, right? Where deadly force could have been used, but the police refrained from using it for one reason or another. It's important to understand why that happens. And so we recommend that the police department begin collecting that information. We have some recommendations with respect to policy as well. And I'll go through and highlight a few of those for you as well. Undoubtedly, you've heard the term de-escalation. It's part of the national conversation that's going on right now around the country involving the police and the use of force. And how can the police do that better, more effectively, so that force is used less often or less severely? So our recommendation here is that the agency FCPD refine its policy approach to emphasize the use of de-escalation to reduce, and it's in the policy. We make some specific recommendations about how we think would be an improvement. And then to emphasize, and this last part of the recommendation I think is important, emphasize that officers should only use the minimum amount of force that's reasonably required to overcome resistance. And it's an unfortunate reality that people resist arrest, and force is sometimes necessary, despite the best efforts and the best de-escalation techniques that we know of. Force is still sometimes required. The question, though, is what level of force. And so a policy recommendation that really puts forth the value of the agency, that what we value is the minimum amount of force that's required to overcome the resistance, we think is important. The first bullet point, I think, is also a very important recommendation. General Order 540.8 is the Police Department's general order that deals with the use of deadly force. And it has a provision in there that's it's not unique to the Fairfax County Police Department. There's other agencies that have a similar provision as well. That speaks about the use of deadly force to apprehend fleeing felons. The language, if you look at it historically, is probably drawn from Tennessee versus Garner, from what lawyers would call dicta in Tennessee versus Garner. The reality is, though, that the better approach to a policy that addresses the use of deadly force by police is to have a very, very clear statement that deadly force is only authorized if the suspect poses an imminent risk of death or serious injury to the officer or others. It's not clear right now in the fleeing felon portion of that policy whether that's the case or not. And so our recommendation is that be clarified and made very clear. And I'm going to, again, in the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Robin Engel, and let her close us out and discuss our training and organizational recommendations that we have in the report as well.
Very good, thank you. Good afternoon. I have two pieces of good news. I'm not going to talk about statistics, and I'm the last speaker. Thank you so much on behalf of our team. This was a really great study and a great opportunity for us to learn not just what's happening here in your county, of course, but also being able to take that information back to other agencies across the country so they can use this as an example of how they can better collect data, analyze that data, and use that information to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in policing, and also, of course, to make those police-citizen encounters safer. So this is the first step, and I'm proud to be a part of it. What I've been asked to speak about here are just a couple of the training recommendations that we put forward. The truth is, we know very little about what training works best in policing. My research team at the University of Cincinnati has really taken this on as a task now so that we can start building that evidence base. And I want to tell you a little bit about what we have been finding. So one of our first recommendations is that we really need to increase the amount of training that's provided annually for de-escalation specifically, their skills and tactics. We do have recent evidence that shows that de-escalation training is affiliated with reductions in officer uses of force, reductions in officer injuries, and citizen injuries. So this is an emerging and building body of evidence. It's small yet, but nonetheless, we do have some evidence to suggest that this is having an impact. So we recommend that the training hours then be substantially increased here for those particular types of tactics and skills. And further, that we really start moving our training in law enforcement from a stress-oriented approach, paramilitary style, for example, to more of a resiliency-based approach, where we're emphasizing critical decision-making skills, communication, emotional intelligence, those types of skills. So with that, one of the other recommendations we have specifically is about the use of ICAT training. ICAT stands for Integrating Communications, Assessment, and Tactics. And the ICAT training is a form of de-escalation training. It's been put forward by the Police Executive Research Forum, and to date, it is the only de-escalation training that has a body of evidence that's emerging that demonstrates that it does have this impact. Now, there are other de-escalation trainings available. They just haven't been tested in this way. So we wanted to put forth a recommendation that we believe to be evidence-based. And we further recommend that the agency really consider the adoption of a co-responder model for how we interact with persons in crisis, whether it be behavioral health issues or intellectual and developmental disabilities, but of course how we respond to individuals in crisis. A lot of times that does lend itself to issues of use of force that we think could be reduced for these particular populations and in these particular types of situations. And so the co-responder models do have a body of evidence that suggests that they are effective at reducing those types of issues and problems. And so that's one of our recommendations. And then finally here, the last slide for you folks. This next recommendation is not evidence-based, but it's theoretically driven. So our thought here is that perhaps we should be considering rotating officers out of our high crime patrol areas and districts and stations on a routine basis. Now, in community policing in the 1980s, we talked about having officers be in the community, be right there. You know your officer, you build that relationship in those neighborhoods. And while we believe that still to be true, to be a strength, the problem is that when you have routine and repeat exposure to trauma, to situations in high-risk communities, that there's a desensitization for officers, and that they may not be responding in the same ways that we would like, and that lack sometimes of empathy that may occur for that routine exposure. So here we're considering, it probably makes sense for both officer safety wellness, but also for the safety and wellness of citizens and communities, that we have a rotation of officers that come in through these communities, and that we could actually reduce racial and ethnic disparities as a result. Now, this is not specifically tested, but our recommendation here is that we at least have a conversation about what that would look like. As we are all talking around the country about reimagining policing, we really want to start thinking outside the box and things that we have traditionally done. Maybe there are other approaches to continue to help reduce racial and ethnic disparities that we should consider. Annual and biannual follow-up analyses. Listen, just the fact that the data is being looked at can have an impact on reducing racial and ethnic disparities. Collecting the data, making sure that officers know that that data is important, that it's being used, that it's being made public, and then routinely going back to see what the improvements are, and then holding officers and command staff responsible for continual improvement over time can really make a difference. So, of course, we recommend that as well. And then finally, body-worn camera footage. At the beginning with body-worn camera footage, everybody thought, well, this is going to reduce force. Well, we're not really seeing across the country that it reduces force, but we are collecting so much information that could be used as another data source to impact training and to help, again, reduce racial and ethnic disparities as a result. And that is what happens when you talk with your hands. And so the good news is I am done speaking at this point. I think we are going to open it up for questions. Is that correct? So my colleague Mike Smith will be taking that over.
Yeah, before we do that, if I could just make a couple points first.
Sure.
First, I'd like to say thank you very much, Drs. Engel, Smith, and Tilliard. Thank you for condensing this presentation. You guys had so many pages in the original document and making the findings clearer for us. I appreciate the approach that you have taken to uncover the greater details on disparities in the use of force. Additionally, I support the detailed analysis used to document the recommendations that were made on improving data collection, use of force changes, and training and organizational development recommendations. So each of those I want to acknowledge. So Dr. Smith, before we have you come back, I'd like to give Chief Davis an opportunity first to provide a response on the findings and recommendations, and what I'll do is once he's concluded, I'll open it up.
Thank you, Chairman Luss, Chairman McKay, Board of Supervisors. And it is a response, it's not a rebuttal, because we are so grateful for this roadmap that we will use to get better in Fairfax County. And as you see the number of commanders that are here with me today, I promise I didn't make them come. They're very interested in this report, and we're all very interested in the report. And as we hear about the pointing of a firearm, by my unscientific analysis, at least a third of the 1,300 uses of force that were examined involve the pointing of a firearm by a police officer at another person. So that's loud and clear to us. Why is that happening, and what can we do to reduce that number? Underway right now, procedural justice training, implicit bias training. That's just a piece of it. And Dr. Engel, who's a hard act to follow, teed up ICAT. So you all probably heard me talk about ICAT before I was in this uniform. That's on its way to Fairfax County. The executive director of the Police Executive Research Forum, Chuck Wexler, and I had a conversation. I know Dr. Smith, Dr. Tillier, and Dr. Engel are all very familiar with Chuck and his team, and I think just very recently Dr. Engel did some work evaluating ICAT. I was one of the first in 2016. It's gotten so much better since then. De-escalation, diffusion, time and distance, tactical repositioning. So that's coming this calendar year to Fairfax. So jumping into the what have we done, and I'll be brief, and what's in progress, the two categories, and then I'll sit down. I mentioned ICAT, that's on the way. We have amended, as you all know, and it's just about done, and it will meet your final approval, the vehicle pursuit policy. And I know a lot of these things are included in our community matrix as well, so there's a lot of overlap here. Our agency has also amended the use of force reporting to distinguish between force used against animals and vehicles versus force used against persons. That's done. What else is done? And these are included in the recommendations by University of Texas at San Antonio. Our reporting system now includes a drop-down menu to report civilian demeanor and various levels of resistance. And the team spoke about the sequential measurement of events before use of force is used, and that's the gold standard nowadays, and that's on its way as well. We've also added an effectiveness field to identify when a control tactic was effective or ineffective. That's done. So the following are in progress. We are just a month or so away from identifying, selecting a new vendor for our records management system. That's exciting. Yes. We're working to amend several forms to include the other conditions that may contribute to a use of force scenario, such as weather, lighting, and we want to capture injury data, not only injury data for the person who force was used against, but police officer injury data as well. What are the severities? Instead of just saying injury, what type of injury? So that's in the works as well. We also are in the process of adding an other field to capture situations that don't conveniently fit into pre-established fields. And we're working to better document each and every use of force incident, including encounters. And this is and I leaned over to Deputy County Executive Orr and said, this is where we need to go. People smarter than me need to figure out how to do this accurately. When we could have used force and didn't, and dialing and getting that down to the cops. When could you have used force, but what happened that prevented you from using force? And then how can you then inform the agency that you could have used force, but you didn't? It sounds a little, we need to get there. Mm-hmm. And then the co-responder model, which is also in progress, and we're also creating a performance review board that will examine when a certain use of force threshold is hit, the performances of our police officers, and we'll use that not only as a use of force review, but a performance evaluation so we can improve our training. We're just hopefully a couple days away from hiring our PhD level data director, and that will be very exciting as well. And we're all interested and committed to this roadmap, and we can't thank this talented team enough for what they have done, not only for us, but what they have done and are doing for policing as a profession. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much, Chief Davis. I want to acknowledge both in your response that this will help make our Fairfax County Police Department better. And I agree that there are a number of recommendations that we can begin to implement immediately. So I appreciate the point on those items as well. And we'll say, looking specifically at the use of force policy, addressing our data collection, and really instituting the ICAT and the CIT training for all our officers is going to be necessary and vital. So having said that, I will now move to the Q&A section of our presentation here today. And I'd like to go ahead and start personally, and then I'll open it up to my colleagues. So Dr. Smith, if you want to come down, I think you and I had a little conversation about this just a few minutes before the presentation here. And I'm going to admit, when I read the report, the one head scratcher that I had was connected to the statement in your report that force used against white civilians was at a rate that exceeded their representation in all 6 suspect and arrestee benchmarks. So can you clarify for me that during your analysis that you were able to disaggregate the non-white Hispanic numbers from this tally for white civilians?
That's correct. We were.
Okay. And then as a follow-up, should we interpret this to mean that across the demographics, to include white residents here in the county, that we have an issue with use of force in this community?
Well, there's, as you point out, and thank you for the question, there's a lot there, and it's complex. And as we chatted before, the finding particularly for whites is, and I alluded to it, it's puzzling. It's not one you typically see.
Right.
I think it's incumbent upon those of us who do this kind of work to say when we don't know the answer to things. And I don't know the answer. I don't think the team knows the answer for why the force rates exceed the benchmarks so consistently for whites. I don't have a good answer for that. I do think, though, that, and Chief Davis alluded to this, there's something going on with pointing of weapons that we need to drill down further into. And there's a fair number of those, as he alluded to, represented in the data. So some of that may explain some of the findings, not just for whites, but clearly for African Americans, because we know we did that analysis, right? Yeah. So I wish I had a more fulsome answer for you, Supervisor Lusk, but I don't at this moment.
Okay, that's fine. I just wanted you to give your best answer here, so thank you for doing that. I also think it's really important that we not look at this disparity just in terms of race, but also to look at it also from this geography standpoint. So in your benchmarking by district station, I'm going to admit this was also eye-opening. The disparities amongst African American, Hispanic, Asian by specific police stations. And I do believe it's important for us to highlight this data in order to avoid confusion or inaccurate conclusions as to its relationship and disproportionality of use of force against members of our non-white community. So with the recommendations that you have put, you note that Fairfax County should consider rotating the officers in some of these different stations as a way to kind of bring down that disparity and really to reduce the possibility of the influence of implicit bias. Mm-hmm. And I think, to me, that makes sense. So with that in mind, and understanding that you've obviously looked at this issue in other localities, and that you've worked to help address disproportionality in those other localities, what other methods would you suggest that we consider to reduce this disparity within these individual police district stations?
So I think the best answer to your question is to refer back to some of the recommendations that are included in the report, although not couched directly at the premise of your question. Right. That is not directly addressed at disparities within particular district stations, but they are all targeted toward the reduction of force severity and disparities writ large. And to the extent that, right, that ICAT training, the rotating officers out of high crime patrol areas and district stations, some of the policy changes that we're recommending, the fact, and Dr. Engel alluded to this, the fact that we're doing this study for you, and that the county is committed to it, is making that this is a public forum. The report is public. All of this, I think, together, will begin to create a different climate that I think should help over time reduce some of those disparities at the district station level. And as you and I discussed once before, right, particularly with African Americans, there's a countywide finding, and the other thing that I should point out is that we, researchers like myself, Dr. Engel, Dr. Tillier, that do this kind of work, we look at a lot of data, both within and across agencies. We tend to look for consistencies, for patterns, to help inform areas of concern. It's, you may have a finding of disparity for one particular racial group, and it's an outlier. It's in one district station. It doesn't appear anywhere else, and it's not across all of the different kinds of analyses that we do. It's not that we don't care about that, but what's really concerning is when you have a sort of a consistent message or a consistent story that the data tell you. Mm-hmm. And so for African Americans, you saw that they were overrepresented across 4 of the 6 benchmarks. Mm-hmm. You saw that they were overrepresented in 4 of the 6 multivariate severity models. You saw that they were overrepresented in the arrest model. That's the kind of consistent story that I think is ripe for conversation and potentially for directed mechanisms to try to address. That said, it's also very clear that that's not an across-the-board finding in the county, right? That's being driven primarily by a handful of district stations, and one in particular. So it makes the task potentially more manageable to address those disparities.
Okay. No, I appreciate that answer. What I'd like to do now is go ahead and open it up for my colleagues to ask questions, and I'll start with Chairman McKay.
Thank you, Supervisor Lusk, and thank you for the report. I'm certainly glad we did this. I think, data speaks volumes, and one of the things I know we need to do better on is data collection. And clearly, you've given some recommendations. We've heard from the chief loud and clear that we're heading in that direction, which is good. I have just a quick number of questions here. First, we talked about the officer rotation. Did you analyze supervisory rotation as well? I know for some of us, the captains and higher ranking folks within the police department are on rotation, and mm-hmm. I don't know if you found that to be appropriate or if you even looked at that element.
So from an analytic standpoint, we did not. Just conceptually, though, I can tell you that's a very, it's perceptive of you to ask that question. It's a very new sort of line of research inquiry that folks like myself, Dr. Engel, Dr. Tillier, are engaging in, just sort of beginning to look at the impact that supervisory change, a variety of variables associated with supervisors may have on officer outcomes, force, traffic stops, pedestrian stops, whatever the case may be. So long answer, though, we don't have good evidence or good data on it yet, but there's certainly, I think, a recognition that potentially could be an important driver of some of the outcomes that we see consistently across agencies. So there's a lot more work to be done there.
Okay. I appreciate that. And then the other piece that jumps out at me is we did an analysis of white, black, Hispanic, Asian. But of course, you know, our community is made up of way more people than that. And, you know, some may self-identify a different way. Some may be mixed race. Some people who might be of Middle Eastern background might not fall neatly into one of these categories. And so, you know, I know at some point you have to look at the major population groups, but I am assuming for the purpose of the data collection that these people were classified in either an incident report, an arrest report, that they were classified by the officers, or or was there a classification, individual classification done?
So we didn't do the classification.
Right.
The classification was available and identified in the data themselves. You know, we got a lot of different data from a lot of different data sources, but you know, the use of force data, for example, comes from the Blue Team use of force database primarily. It has a race drop-down sort of menu that typically follows the census categories, as does the report. So, and those data were pre-populated. We got them from the police department. How they, and maybe Chief Davis could speak to that, you know, how the officers populate those fields, you know, is typically driven by a variety of things. Sometimes they have driver's licenses, they have other identification that they can draw from. You know, sometimes they ask the individual, you know, to self-identify. It's a variety of things typically, but the larger point is exactly right. That, you know, this is a very heterogeneous community in Fairfax County, and I can tell you from having done a lot of the similar kind of work with traffic stops and pedestrian stops and racial classifications and within those studies, that not every community does it the same way, right? So if particular community, and I'm working with one now, for example, has got a large Middle Eastern population, they actually have a race ethnicity field in their data collection system for Middle Eastern because it's salient in that particular community. So you know, you're not necessarily locked into the census categories. That said, sometimes the more categories you add, the more difficult it becomes to put people in categories, and it becomes challenging for the police agency.
Yeah, I know it's a difficult one. I just want to make sure with a community as diverse as ours that, you know, I don't think we're missing anything glaring, but we might be missing something through these classifications. And so obviously they're imperfect, just like any data we're going to get it's going to require some interpretation, but we obviously are a much more diverse group than necessarily these categories. But I most definitely appreciate the complication with that. The other question I have is, in your recommendations here, you know, the heading is selected recommendations. Obviously, there are more.
Yes.
Were these recommendations made to us in priority order, or did you pull the selected ones that you thought were the most salient or
Yes.
most best practice? How did you arrive at which ones to present today versus the totality of the ones in the report?
Right. So for the purposes of the presentation, and really just in the interest of time, we pulled some out, and there's some others that you'll see in the report that are not on the PowerPoint slides. You know, they were, I think it's fair to say, our sense, you know, as the research team who does this sort of work routinely, of ones that we wanted to call your attention to. But that's not to minimize any of the others that are in the report either.
Right. Okay. And then my last question, and this may be the toughest one, but what surprised you the most in this entire process in terms of data collection, in terms of maybe preconceived notions of the department here, the organization, the community, versus what you found in the data, if anything?
Thank you for that, and we've already alluded to it. The white disparity finding surprised me, and you know, it's unfortunate and also not atypical at all to find overrepresentation of African Americans across a variety of analyses. and that as in police outcomes, whether it's force or any other kind of outcome. That's not an uncommon finding. So I wasn't surprised by that. I was surprised by the White finding.
Okay, and then one final thing, because for folks who are watching this and don't have the luxury of reading the entire report, the one thing that's hard to grasp is just the number of use of force incidents per capita and how our jurisdiction just compares to other jurisdictions of a similar size.
Right.
Do you have any thumbnail way of describing just the sheer incidents here, the number of them, and how they might compare to similar departments of our size across the country?
Thank you for that question. And the short answer is no, but let me explain why. And we had a conversation about that as well before the meeting. It's very difficult to do that in any kind of informed way. And the reason for that, there's a variety of reasons for that. One of the primary drivers for the count of cases, use of force cases, has nothing to do with the conditions on the ground, right? The street level conditions, levels of crime, population density, all the drivers of things that cause disorder and crime. Although those are certainly important and inform this question about how force rates vary from community to community. But what's even more important is the way in which the data are collected. And that varies significantly from agency to agency. So we talked about pointing of a firearm. Dr. Engel mentioned that Fairfax County collects that information. Many agencies do not. And it's a significant portion of the force cases here in Fairfax County are those weapon pointing instances, right? So if you try to compare Fairfax County to the agency next door or the community next door, even if it looked just like yours and they don't collect firearm pointings, then you're comparing apples to oranges. And there's a whole variety of other similar kinds of things that make those sort of direct comparisons sort of really fraught and something that we don't, as social scientists, typically do.
I think so. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I will go to Supervisor Alcorn and then come back towards myself.
Thank you very much, Chair Lusk. Couple of questions. First, on the issue of the use of force levels, and you were just saying a lot of jurisdictions don't even measure pointing of a weapon. Just to confirm, in terms of firearms, the firearms that our patrol officers carry are loaded, correct?
Yes, sir, to my knowledge.
So we're talking about basically pointing a loaded firearm at somebody. I think, and I would just say for me personally, that's definitely an L3. That's not an L1. Restraint, soft hand control does not involve the potential of deadly force. So I frankly would discount at least the analysis putting that into L1, but I very much appreciate you flagging that as a difference in the methodology. You had said earlier that even though the media likes to do comparisons with the background population demographics, that's not scientifically sound. In the numbers, force rates by race and ethnicity, white, 38.2% of the total. I'm going to do that anyway. I'm going to basically point out that Fairfax County non-Hispanic whites is about 50%. Mm-hmm. When would it be appropriate to take into consideration the background demographic population of a community?
Depends on the outcome that you're looking at, right? And so when you're talking about an enforcement outcome, and particularly in this case, when you're talking about use of force, you have to go through a number of steps, not always, but a number of steps before you get there, right? It's different than writing someone a traffic ticket. And so what social scientists like us do is we look for, and there's evidence about this, we test these sort of things, right? We look for those benchmarks that represent the best estimate of those at risk for the particular outcome of interest. And that risk is not equally distributed across any community. And depending on what the outcome is, that risk can look very different than the residential population. And sometimes, depending on what the outcome is, calls for service, contacts, even those are driven by community factors that vary by demographic oftentimes. So, you know, it's a long answer to your question. I'm hesitant to say that there's any outcome that typically is analyzed that is of interest, right, to communities and social scientists who help them understand these outcomes. I have a hard time thinking of any where the use of the census would be the closest estimate of what the population is at risk for that outcome. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, and we acknowledge this, and I think any good social scientist should acknowledge that any benchmark is just that. It is an estimate. None of them are perfect. Some of them are less perfect than others. We try to pick the ones that are more perfect than the less perfect ones, with full sort of acknowledgement and recognition that none of them are ideal.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I appreciate that. I guess it is the question in if the analysis relates to the risk and what's at risk. And I realize, and you're saying social scientists don't measure looking at population. I do. I would think that actually it's very important for all of our public services, particularly when ones relating to law enforcement, actually that we do watch that. I think we have to. And again, that's speaking as an elected official, not as a social scientist.
I understand, sir.
But thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Supervisor Alcorn. Supervisor Palchik.
Thank you, Chair Lusk, and thank you, all of you, for this presentation. You know, and I really appreciate, I think this is very useful, very helpful data and analysis, and following up on so much that was said by the chairman. I think one question I have, because I appreciate that you have these recommendations, and often in social research, I have seen recommendations for further research, as well as use of mixed methods. So were we to go back, is this something you've done to go back either to a focus group, a community advisory committee? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm mistaken, is that this was done without engagement with community stakeholders, right? So I'm just wondering, right, next steps, recommendations.
It's an excellent question, and thank you for that. And yes, so our engagement in this particular project was limited to a sort of in-depth deep dive of your data. But I am 100% in agreement with you that a mixed methods approach the next time is preferable. And we often do that, by the way, in other projects. That is our preference, in fact. There's much to be learned from a variety of qualitative techniques that to supplement and to help you gain a greater understanding of just what the data are and what the numbers say. And I would absolutely encourage the county to next time to frame its RFP and it's around a mixed methods approach, because I think it will tell you a lot.
I appreciate, I think you can tell, anthropology is my background, so I appreciate the qualitative methods. And then I guess as we're thinking about future studies, are there specific questions you still had? I know you mentioned a few that you think would help us really think through some of the recommendations, whether it's how we categorize, how we collect data, some wonderings that are still really stood out in your mind at the end of this that you haven't mentioned yet.
That we haven't mentioned. The white disparity is the glaring one, but beyond that, and I'm gonna maybe are your microphones on back there, guys? I'm gonna punt that to my team, and I'll come back, but I'd like to give them an opportunity to weigh in on that.
Thank you for the question. I would really like to expand and better understand about first-line supervision now, with the caveat of what was mentioned here about the rotating of captains, but I would suggest to you that it's actually at the sergeant level where you can see the most impact on officer behavior. And I say this because many years ago, I wrote a dissertation looking at first-line supervisors and the impact on officers. And in fact, what I found was that the style of the first-line supervisor actually did have an impact on officers' likelihood of use of force. Now, that was many years ago with systematic social observation data, which means we went with officers, we rode everywhere they did. It was a mixed method study, and we had a body of evidence that we could use from the 1990s that has not been replicated again. And I really think that there is such great opportunity in police departments across the country to really focus on the leadership skills of those first-line supervisors. The second thing that I would mention that I would think the chief would be interested in as well is the use of de-escalation tactics and skills and actually capturing that information. When they do that, it's twofold. It's one, telling the officers, this is important for you to do, so we're capturing it on this form. But secondly, it gives the police agency an opportunity to see what's the most effective use of those de-escalation tactics and skills so that we can make police-citizen encounters safer. So those are a couple, I think, of easy, quick wins, low-hanging fruit that we could really think about, and I also believe would be related to reducing racial and ethnic disparities.
Yeah, thank you. And I would sort of jump off that and say I think that what we're trying to understand are very complex encounters, events, situations, and I think it's fair to say, and this isn't a criticism of this department, it's a lot of departments. We don't have good enough information of really the nuances of what happens in these incidents. So we recommended, for example, collection, I think the chief referenced that they're starting to do this, collection of demeanor of the citizen, right? So a better, more in-depth understanding of the civilian's involvement and what their actions are, and being able to unpack the sequence of events, right? How did we end up at the end with this level of force? What preceded it? And that would speak to and allow us to get at some of the de-escalation techniques that are or aren't being used depending on the situation. So, there's always more questions, and they always come with, we need better, more precise understanding and data, and those would be a couple I think that would be helpful.
And again, I'm just going to close out really quickly because I know there's other questions. Two of our recommendations, one involved rotating officers out of high crime districts and patrol areas. And Dr. Engel alluded to the fact that there's sound theoretical reasons to believe that might help ameliorate some of the overall uses of force and also the disparities in force. That's a natural experiment just waiting to happen, and it should be tried, I believe. And the last point I'll make is, and because this goes back to what both of my colleagues were talking about, the complexity of these events. One of our recommendations is that the police department begin to, I know that it's now, I believe, fully rolled out, body-worn cameras or maybe close, but that is a gold mine of information that is sitting in the cloud in police departments all over the country, and very few people have ever tried to make use of it. And there's a tremendous amount to be learned from studying body-worn cameras systematically, body-worn camera data.
And I'm sorry, if I could, just one more thing, and I think this speaks to what you mentioned before about mixed methods. A lot of times what I tell police chiefs is even if the data shows that you don't have racial or ethnic disparities, which hardly ever happens, by the way, or that you don't have an issue with use of force, if your citizens perceive that you do, you still have a problem. And if your officers perceive that your citizens don't support them, you have a problem, right? So thinking through how this community can really bridge that gap between officers and citizens, and working on identifying where those gaps are and the types of things that we can do to reduce those conflicts, I think is really important. Sorry.
Thank you. No, I've taken a lot of time. Really appreciate the methodology and research. And I know the chief has good data to move forward. Okay,
thank you, Supervisor Palachuk. We have, just so we're clear on the time count, about 10 minutes left. We have 6 board members that need to speak. So if that's the case, you've got basically a minute for your time. So next up is Supervisor Stewart.
Thank you, and I will ask a couple questions, but not expect answers. But first, I wanted to thank you very much for the valuable, really actionable report, and I'm pleased to have been part of asking this to be done. I wish we'd been able to get you all here sooner. I know that's taken a little bit longer to complete the report and do some things that we were looking for. And I know that in the end, the data does matter. It does help us to see things as they are, maybe not as we wish they were, or even as we perceive they are. And I think all of that is a positive. Obviously, the Mount Vernon District Station results are very concerning, deeply concerning to me. In Mount Vernon District, we actually are served by 3 stations, and all 3 of them have issues of overuse, if you will, Franconia and West Springfield. So we know we have challenges that go across the board, but we know in particular areas we have greater challenges. And I think the key to me is to try to see, is there any trend data that we can get out of this? So the data that you took, the 3 years, 2016 to 2018, you took it as a set of data, or did you do any kind of annual analysis or any kind of sub-analysis that we could see if there's any kind of change of that trend, if you will, during the course of the 3 years?
Right. So the severity models actually have a time indicator built into them. So we looked at the impact, the effect of different years on the severity or the average level or the totality of force, and we did see an effect, right? So the 2017-2018 years were higher, as I recall, than the 2016 year, for example. So the year did matter, and we did consider that to that extent. Is there more we could do, sort of drilling into it year by year? Yes, there is.
I'm deeply committed to ongoing, continuing this process. I think it's essential. And the other last question is, this is a Deputy Chief Rohrer question, but I thought we had de-escalation training going across the board, that we've been doing it for at least 4 or 5 years. Is that, because one of the recommendations was that, so is that something that is just a follow-on, or this is something more than what we've been doing?
I'll let Chief Davis, if he wishes to go further, but the de-escalation training was begun officially by Chief Rossler. It was probably 3 or 4 years ago, at least, maybe 5. Came out of the PERF recommendations, the use of force report that PERF did.
That's why I'm raising, but they've raised it as a recommendation, so I was confused about that.
So Supervisor Stewart, the ICAT training, it's based on a UK use of force training model, integrating communications, assessments, and tactics. It includes de-escalation or the synonym, diffusion, but it also includes real-time practical training on how to use time and distance and tactical repositioning for police officers as they respond to crises. So it's a step. It's the next level. Is that scientific?
So it is beyond what we've been doing. I just wanted to maybe take this.
Yes,
so it's
sir.
Beyond what we've been doing training-wise.
It includes it, and it's beyond. It's absolutely beyond.
All right. Thank you. I have other questions, but we'll have to deal with those later.
Thank you, Supervisor Stork. Supervisor Smith, please.
I'm just going to pass and let other people ask. I appreciate all the information, and I'm looking forward to new trainings and things that we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Smith. Supervisor Gress. Vice Chairman Gress.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the distilled version of that very, very long report that I started to read and decided that, I didn't do that in college, so I wasn't going to be able to understand this one. I have a challenge with the rotation of officers. That's a real concern, I think, and we need to talk more about that, because the community is going to expect something different, I think. When whatever we do here, there are those in the community who are going to say we've gone too far, and there are those who will say we haven't gone far enough. And so I have a budget Q&A, I think, for Chief Davis. You don't need to answer this today, but I would like to put it out there. For the training and retraining, what is our capacity, our cost, and our timing for that? That would be helpful to know. Also, as we make changes, you talk a lot about communication with your officers. What about how are we going to communicate to the community about some of these changes? Because in some cases they'll be looked on as positive and some will be looked on as negative. So I think we really need to have a communications plan with the community overall. And then I just have one quick question. These pages are not numbered, so I'm not sure, but it's this particular page, and it says here, officer female only, and it has a red line that says, indicates a negative relationship. Could somebody quickly help me understand what that means?
So in I think one of the models that we ran, if the event, the use of force event involved only female officers, so it wasn't mixed gender and it wasn't all male, if it was only females, there was a reduction in the severity of force in that particular assessment.
Reduction in the severity of force, so the red indicates a negative.
A negative relationship, yes, ma'am.
Okay, so could somebody get back to me on that one? I'd like to understand that one a little bit better.
In plain language, in one of the models, if it was all women officers, all female officers, the force was less. It wasn't.
As you might expect.
As you might expect, yes, ma'am. I mean, in just sort of, everyday understanding of gender, yes, I think that's right.
Okay, so that I was interpreting the red as not so good. All right, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chairman Gross. Supervisor Faust.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the presentation. I have a question again back to methodology. I think you said that a benchmark should never take into account population, and you used arrest. Is that a simplified summary of where we're at here?
Arrest and suspects. We also use reported suspects.
Okay. Do other experts and consultants use population variables that you don't use?
A few.
And
one that I can think of.
Pardon?
One that I can think of in particular.
Just one? Who's that?
Philip Goff.
Okay. When you use arrest, do you have to make an assumption about whether there is prejudice shown or that occurs in the arrest process?
Yes, that's a very good question. And so the answer is yes. That potentially, as I said before, highlighted again as many times as I'm allowed. Every benchmark is imperfect. One of the imperfections in the arrest benchmark is if there are disparities built into the benchmark, right? Then you potentially could wash out the effect, the comparative effect. That said, we reported 3 different arrest benchmarks. We know from a lot of years of criminological research that racial disparities in violent arrests are much less than they are with lesser offenses, right? So we built in a violent-only arrest benchmark. Because those are the arrests that typically have less, and we know this, empirically, less disparity or bias built into them. Okay.
Okay, I'm not sure to follow that, but the other question I had was, you started out treating pointing a gun as a level 3, and then you presented the results using level 1. Did you also present what the results would have been if you maintained a level 3 for pointing a weapon?
Well, that is the original analysis, was based on the categorizing pointing a weapon, a firearm at level 3 and pointing a taser at level 2.
So that's in your big report?
Yes, sir. All the findings that we went over were based on that original analysis.
But your summary as you presented it today was based on the level 3 and level 2?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, now, that's good. I thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Supervisor Faust. Supervisor Harity.
I'm going to try to be quick, but I've got a number of questions, and I'll start go back to Dr. Engel's comments, where if you have a perception of a problem, then you've got a problem. And, your report in several instances says the use of static census population counts of identifiable racial and ethnic groups as a benchmark for police use of force is unsound and depends upon undefendable assumptions or something along those lines. But we regularly publish that. And as the board knows, I've been asking for a caveat underneath of those numbers saying just that. But, I mean, would you recommend us publishing use of force data against population benchmarks? I assume not based on the comments, but I figured I would ask. Sorry to put you on the spot.
As social scientists, we would not do that. Okay. We don't do that. I understand that from a community perspective and from a political perspective, that's looking at the question through a different lens, and I appreciate that.
What makes it difficult, of course, is that you've got residents, a lot of the arrests are against, and uses of force incidents are against non-residents that travel to our jurisdiction. So do you compare it to our demographics? Do you compare it to the regions? Do you? Right. So I would hope that as a recommendation from this, the board would at least look at caveating or asterisking or footnoting those charts with some kind of statement out of the report that talks about how that's not necessarily the best way to look at the use of force thing. So I think another one in your report, you talked about the presence of drugs and or alcohol not being recorded, but that didn't make your short list of recommendations. Is there a reason?
In the actual report itself, yep. There's detailed recommendations about capturing drug and alcohol and attaching that to individuals rather than incidents. Correct. We could only look at the incident level, okay. But there is a recommendation in the report. It's not on the PowerPoint, though, okay. That the police department actually connect that to individual people.
I think that's an important one as we move forward, Chief, just because I think it weighs into certain ones. I'm going to go to rotation of officers. I'm not going to repeat what Penny said, but I think there's got to be a balance there. I understand PTSD and battle fatigue and all that other stuff and being in stressful situations, but at the same time, we've got those community relationships that are so important that somehow we've got to figure out how to balance those two because it's a tough balance. You want people that know the community, but at the same time, you don't want them ending up. I'm going to go to pointing of weapons. As someone who's had a police officer point a gun at him, it does change the equation, and it changes it real quick. And I've been out with our narcotics unit. They use the pointing of weapons to actually de-escalate a situation, and they do it better than anybody I've seen. Our current Commonwealth attorney's been out and seen it. So I would suggest anybody who hasn't gone on a ride along with the narcotics unit, go out and see what they do and how they do it and how the pointing of a weapon by a properly trained officer actually de-escalates the situation. So I think I'm ready to recommend that stay L1 or BL1, but I'd have to think about that a little bit more. And again, our guys are trained pretty well. Was there anything in the report in terms of conditions on, a lot of this is balancing the use of force, but also we've got to balance the impact on public safety and the safety of our officers. Mm-hmm. Was that included anywhere? I didn't see it anywhere in the report, what some of these recommendations do, both to the safety of our officers and public safety in general.
So I'll thank you for the question. There's not a single recommendation in that report that we believe or that I think the evidence would suggest would put any officer at risk. Not a single one, and we would never do that.
Good. That's a good answer.
I think collectively the recommendations are designed to reduce the use of force, the severity of force, and potentially the disparity of force. And we've talked in depth about what some of those are and how they collectively could come together, maybe in ways that we're not even sure of yet. But just again, let me reiterate or highlight that there's no recommendation that would put police officers at risk.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, I think there is a place. Somebody talked about communication, but communicating to our citizens, I think, is something that probably needs to get in here because I think that is in their proper response, because their proper response dictates what the police officer's response is, and I think that's something that we can do some work on.
Okay, thank you, Supervisor Harity. Supervisor Walkinshaw.
Thank you. I have 3 seconds by this point, right?
I'm going to give you more than 3 seconds. Everyone else got more than 3 seconds.
I appreciate
Proceed.
it. Just one point on the re-estimation and reanalysis, and I agree with Supervisor Alcorn. Pointing a firearm is certainly level 3. It's not level 1. I don't think the Police Executive Research Forum would view pointing a firearm as a de-escalation technique. Necessary, effective, maybe in some instances, but not de-escalation. I do have a frustration with that slide in that it's not reflected in the report. I searched the report for re-estimation, and you kind of didn't show your work on that slide, and I think it highlighted an important finding about the pointing of firearms, and maybe the timing didn't work, but I think the public would benefit from learning more how you came to the conclusions that are on that particular slide.
Can I jump in real quick?
Sure, please, yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And the re-estimation occurred after some discussions with, as I indicated, with the police department. That's why they're not in the report. That said, our plan is to issue an amended report that includes those analyses and the tables that were behind them.
Great. Okay, because I think the use of firearm obviously is an pointing of a firearm issue is important for us to consider and for the community to understand. A question for the chief. One of the things that maybe wasn't surprising that the research highlighted was that, frankly, our female officers are doing this better. And I think the research throughout the country has shown this in terms of use of force. In terms of our recruitment efforts, and Chief Davis, you've talked about your challenges and efforts in terms of recruitment. I'm looking at our sworn diversity scorecard from the Chiefs Council, previous Chiefs Council on diversity, and we have numbers and percentages for white, black, Asian, Hispanic. We don't have, at least in this scorecard, numbers in terms of women. And that makes me fear that we're not making a concerted effort to recruit women. I hope that's not the case because the data suggests we need more women in this police department. Can you tell me what your efforts will be to increase the number of women serving in the Fairfax County Police Department, and moving forward, can we get it included in either this diversity scorecard or in a separate scorecard?
Thank you, Supervisor Walkinshaw. And I picked up on Supervisor Gross's remarks regarding female police officers. The national average, and of course we are going to include it, and I'm sorry it's not there right now, we'll fix it. The national average of females in our profession is 12%. We're at 16.5%. So we're better than the national average, but we're not where we want to be. So we are about to take what's called a 30 by 30 pledge. Police chiefs around the country are pledging to enhance their recruiting and hiring efforts. So by the year 2030, 30% of our sworn force will be represented by females. And I think, again, not to belabor the points, the facts are the facts, and we are making that effort. And our digital social media recruiting is now on steroids, and we are going after more diverse candidates.
Okay, thank you. And just very final point, I do hope we will look seriously at the use of force policy in the general orders. I think the recommendations here are right on track and where we need to be. And having a policy on paper doesn't solve a problem, but I think it's a necessary first step to help start addressing this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much, Supervisor Walkinshaw. And I'm going to go ahead and take the chairman's prerogative. We'll close with questions at this point, and I'll just make one statement. So in partnership with the chairman, I'd like to note that there will be 3 actions that this committee, the Public Safety Committee, will be taking in the near term as a result of this particular report and study. 1, we'll be taking all of the recommendations that are included in this report and adding them to our community input matrix. So we'll have them on that document where we have all of the other recommendations. 2nd, we will hold a public input meeting which will include the researchers, and we've had a conversation about this, as well as others in the community, which could include advocates and others, to have the same opportunity that we have here today, which is to hear directly from the researchers and to hear them respond to questions. Third, I will coordinate with both Chairman McKay and Chief Davis to strategize on the development of a community group made up of advocates, community members, police staff, and others to review the UT study with the goal of reporting back to the Public Safety Committee to provide feedback on its findings and discuss timelines for implementation of its recommendations. So that is the three items so everyone here is on board and here's kind of the next steps. And we will communicate through the chief on any items that we can obviously clear in advance of this group meeting, but we'll clearly be reporting at our next Public Safety Committee on each of the items relative to this report. So again, thank you to the board members. Thank you to the researchers for providing, I think, an exceptional presentation here today and answering all of our very detailed questions. So thank you. And this adjourns the Public Safety Committee here on June 29th.
On behalf of the team, thank you.